Welcome to the Fright Lab. I'm Lucas Yoakum. With me tonight, as always, is someone who will always talk about the bear, Joseph Wren. Joe, how are we doing tonight?
My friends, my enemies, everyone who is listening to this podcast, I welcome you, all of you gruesome people, to this very disturbing conversation. It's been had many times in many different ways, but tonight is going to be, shall we say, a group experience. It's going to be something we all share in together, because I don't know if you know this, Lucas, that is how you find peace in yourself, is having a singular group experience somewhere in the middle of the summer.
That was the most unsubtle lead-in to an episode you've done yet. I mean, you're kind of a professional at just burying the lead, but you know,
I feel like it helps sometimes, and at least at this point, it makes me laugh.
That's the most important part. You have to be able to entertain yourself. With that in mind, Ari Aster's 2019 Midsommar is something of a rare thing in the horror world. It's a genuinely upsetting film that is well made and has won a boatload of awards as a result. According to IMDB, Midsommar has won 27 awards and was nominated for 74. That would be absolutely nothing to sneeze at on its own. And how many movies can you think of that make just over $48 million on a budget of about $9 million? But that is all the more impressive when you realize that Midsommar is only the second feature-length film under Ari Aster's belt. Between Midsommar and its predecessor, Hereditary, Aster clearly knows what he's doing. Joe, by the way, have you ever seen Hereditary?
I cannot say I want to see it again, but I am so glad I did. Hereditary is a film we will talk about on this podcast, right?
At some point, yeah.
That sets up a premise and turns left in a good way, but it leaves you feeling unfulfilled because of that premise.
See, I'm actually going to take a very different tack, and for the record, I haven't actually written a script for Hereditary yet, but my thinking about it is actually quite the opposite. The movie doesn't set up a premise and then go left. The movie shows its hand within the first 3 scenes, and then it just never alludes to it until the end of the movie. And when I do the script, I will show you how that mechanic works, or I'll tell you how that mechanic works. But let's not get too distracted here. We're not talking about Hereditary. We're talking about Midsommar. And it can be a little difficult, when you're talking about Midsommar, to say why it's such an effective piece of horror, but at the same time, why it got mainstream resonance. Sure, good-looking movie. It is beautiful and lovingly shot. The cast is really a stacked deck. It's a very good cast, especially with Florence Pugh taking the lead as Danny. And don't worry, we're going to talk about Florence Pugh on screen a bunch more kind of later in this script. So maybe the secret to this movie is that it's really scary and it's pretty freaking graphic, but never in a way that feels like silly or gratuitous. And you've heard me rant before about this concept of elevated horror. Midsommar, in a way, is kind of the ideal film for that conversation. The script for this movie is smart. Sure, it's a weird movie in some ways, but the dialogue and the plot feel very real and very intelligent. And by the way, if this is your first episode of The Fright Lab, go back in our feed to episode 12, where we talk about the subject of elevated horror at length. It's kind of a personal bee in my bonnet. And while you're at it, while you're doing that, subscribe to the show and give us the top ranking that your pod player, whichever one you're using, will allow. But shameless plugs aside, we need to talk about this movie, so let's get back on subject. All of the points I've made are pretty good places to start talking about the success of Midsommar as a production. But this movie manages to talk about some issues that aren't really handled in other films. Consider this a warning. We are going to spoil a bunch of things about Midsommar, along with relating to a handful of other films. So if you haven't seen this one yet, go watch it before you really progress in this episode. I try not to spoil too much, and we will give kind of spoiler alerts when they happen, but it's hard to have a conversation about this movie without spoiling it just a little. So first, let's talk about the details of Midsommar. And before we get a bunch of emails about this, you're going to hear me pronounce it Midsommar and Midsommar a number of times different ways because, well, I wrote this script weeks ago and I'm a little lazy and I try to be correct in my pronunciations, but sometimes I fuck it up. So anyway, let's go on with it.
I was so very sorry to hear about what happened.
I'm sorry.
I invited Danny to come to Sweden.
You know what she's been going through.
Christian says you've got this special week planned.
It's sort of a crazy festival. Special ceremonies and dressing up.
That sounds fun.
Unbelievable.
Welcome and happy midsummer. Skål!
What time is it?
9 p.m.
That can't be right. The sky is blue.
This is what 9 p.m. is like here.
How long have you two been together?
Just over 3.5 years.
4 years.
Really?
Yeah?
What do you think?
It's like another world.
Tomorrow's a big day.
Is it scary?
What is it?
It has special properties.
What am I going through?
We just need to acclimate.
I don't want to acclimate, I want to go.
Absolutely not.
What's happening?
Midsommar focuses on Danny, a young woman who's going through the hardest imaginable time. After a long bout of mental illness, her sister has committed suicide and, in the process, killed their mother and father. To make matters worse, Danny's boyfriend Christian has seemed to have been ambivalent about their relationship for a long time. A short time after her family's death, Danny learns that Christian will be leaving for a remote Swedish village to conduct an anthropological survey. The villagers, called the Horga, practice a form of pre-Christian paganism. Christian's friend group also includes Pelle, a member of the Horga who has secured their introduction to the village. After a bit of an argument, Christian invites Danny along for the trip so she isn't left alone during this vulnerable time period. The Horga, in many ways, seem to have an idyllic culture. They live a seemingly largely pastoral life, removed from many of the modern concerns that we all have, and don't appear to have any real conflict with outsiders. But their practices are, to say the least, very different from the lives that our American protagonists are used to. Their actions don't just seem strange. They're deadly. Soon enough, Christian and his friends are in profound danger, and Danny is being pulled deeper into the culture of the Horga. Now, most of you are probably beginning to wonder why I keep using the term village or culture to describe the Horga. In fact, I'm willing to guess that most of you are asking, well, aren't the Horga just a cult? Why won't you call them a cult? Because, my faithful audience, this subject is entirely deeper than you might imagine. So tonight, we need to ask and hopefully answer these questions. 1. What is a cult? And what separates a cult from a religion or a culture outside of the mainstream? 2. Is the Horga a cult? And 3, why do so many seemingly normal people find themselves struggling to leave cults? Before we proceed, I want to make this point. Discussing religion and culture, it's always a messy thing. It can be difficult to do that in a way that is both respectful of those groups as well as factual. And if you're going to go down the scholastic rabbit hole of cults, you need to be aware that it can be a very dark subject. So we aren't out to insult anybody's worldviews or beliefs here, but many of the things we're going to bring up might seem a little cheap or mean or just a little odd. We hope you know that we're not interested in doing that. We want to be better than that. So, with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get on to the question. What makes a cult a cult? Discussing cults in any formal sense is a difficult thing, especially if you have no formal education as a theologian or a sociologist. That includes me. So let's get some definitions out of the way. Cults are both a religious phenomenon and a consideration of social dynamic. In the religious sense, you can use the word cult in a couple of ways. On one hand, you can refer to any number of small subgroups of a religious community a cult. For instance, you can talk about the worship of the god Sutek in the regions of Tanis and Ombos of ancient Egypt as a cult. That word only implies that they were a small group, but ultimately doesn't mean anything sinister. They were just a particular subsect of a thing. So staying in ancient Egypt for a second, you could also describe the Pharaoh Akhenaten's attempt to turn Egypt into a monotheistic culture as an attempt at starting a state cult. Here again, the term cult can be awfully vague. Actual scholars of Egyptology, I think there may actually be one listening, you're going to already know that talking about the religion of Akhenaten can be both a cult in the sinister sense, but also a cult in the state religion sense. So again, save me the emails. I appreciate it. Okay, so when most people are talking about cults, they're not talking about it in this context. When we use the term cult in the modern era, we're talking mostly about groups akin to like the Manson family or Om Shinrikyo or Jim Jones's People's Temple. If we're going to compare the Horga to a cult, are they a cult in the sense of the worship of a deity within a polytheistic society, or just a particular group within a multi-pronged, multicultural system like ancient Egypt? Or do we mean more in line with the subject of so many true crime documentaries? If we mean the latter and not the former, then there is a system that exists that might help us out here. Dr. Stephen Hassan is a former member of the Unification Church, aka the Moonies. Highly obsessive fans of our show might remember that we referenced them in our episode on Shin Godzilla. So we're not going to go into it here. Suffice it to say, the Unification Church, very complicated subject. After Dr. Hassan left the Unification Church, he went on about learning about how people exit cults, and he developed what is called the BITE model, B-I-T-E, and the full name is the BITE model of authoritarian control. Now, there are some scholarly criticisms of the BITE model, but I find it's a good jumping off point for those lay people in the audience, myself included, to try and figure out what a cult is. So in this case, the word BITE is an acronym standing for behavior, information, thought, and emotion. Dr. Hassan essentially argues that authoritarian or high control groups, read as cults, essentially attempt to control all the behaviors, learned information, thoughts, and emotions of their adherents. So think about it. Whenever you learn about a group that's regarded as a cult, what do you end up hearing? That the cult won't allow a member to do as they please. They won't let them visit family members or have any personal belongings. The cult controls all of the incoming data into a person's life, so they aren't reading the newspaper or even really allowed to talk about the group's leader or what the leaders mean by their teachings. Cultists are forced often to change their name or learn to recite a cult's doctrine from memory, and most of all, never question the leader's interpretation of reality. And as a final note, the cult member is made to be afraid of the outside world, to feel guilty about their desires, and they're just not allowed to doubt. I'm willing to guess that sounds like every single cult you've ever heard of, right? The BITE model covers all of these ideas and a bit more. Arguably, the most important thing to take away from this concept is that cult members are not in control of their own lives. Cults are focused on control just as much as they are focused on potential exploitation or abuse. We will include links to Dr. Hassan's BITE model website, along with several articles critical of his approach in the show notes. So check those out. One last point before we drift back onto the plot of Midsommar. If you or someone you love is in a group using these tactics, or if you have left an organization that used these tactics, there will be some links in the show notes for support and resources. I get it. If someone is in a group like Om Shinrikyo in its worst time, they likely aren't listening to a bunch of horror movie podcasts. But it has to be said that there is always hope, and no one has the right to make you stay in a group like that. Please take care of yourself and your loved ones, and if you can and you need it, seek help. It is available out there.
I'm really glad you brought this up. I would have started this conversation by saying cults generally portray themselves to be a religion, but ultimately their goal is harm, whether it's group suicide or individual beatings beyond life. Don't have a better way to say it, because it is a very, very tense subject. But that model, that idea, it takes away the abuse and makes it not part of the control. Because how do you get to that point if that is your goal? And I think historically there are many cults who that was their goal. And control was the number one thing for whoever was in charge, whoever was starting the cult, or whoever was trying to control people. It is so shocking to me because I think about, what is it that you always hear anytime a cult is discussed? How can an intelligent person buy into this or follow this and not question every aspect of it?
You know, I'm going to touch on that kind of nearing the end of my script, because believe me, it's something I thought about a lot as I was researching and writing this episode. And one of the things that I can't say enough, and one of the things I can't point out enough, no one is immune to propaganda. No one. And I'll kind of more poetically explain that later on. But I think there's something that could always hook anyone. And we've all been in positions at some point in our life when we're vulnerable, and all it takes is the right set of stimuli to get you there. You know, think about a group like Heaven's Gate. For those of you who might not know, Heaven's Gate was a kind of sci-fi Christianity cult, is kind of the only way I can explain it. It's a very complicated group who committed mass suicide in, I want to say, the early 90s. Really just a sad story in a lot of ways. But when you look at the history of that organization, there were no beatings. There wasn't any deprivation. If a person left, they weren't harmed in any way. They weren't chased down. You know, they were let go, which you can't say about a lot of cults. And that makes the death of the members of Heaven's Gate so much more sad, I think, because no one was forced to be there, and they were all there because they really believed it. When we talk about what a cult wants, it's kind of like saying what does a sociopath want, because cults are kind of sociopathic groups in a way. But I also sort of think that if we're going to say the question, well, how does this seemingly smart, normal person end up in a cult? Well, smart and normal are practically statistical aberrations. You know what I mean? There's no such thing as normal. Normal is highly relative. You know, why did Om Shinrikyo attract some of the smartest, brightest, best paid, most credentialed engineers and scientists that, you know, Tokyo University could produce? Because they just found the right thing.
That's an absurd question. That's my point. That's not even on the spectrum of what we should be talking about. We should be talking about how they control the behavior of people and how terrible that is.
Oh, totally. I mean, given everything that we've talked about thus far, is the Horga a cult in the most common sense of the word? Well, if you mean in the sense of Jim Jones and David Koresh's Branch Davidians, the answer is mostly no. You can argue that the Horga is taking advantage of our protagonist who's going through, let's just say, a hard fucking time. The Horga uses hallucinogenic drugs as part of their communal ceremonies, but that doesn't adequately explain it, even if they aren't adequately explaining the drug use to her. The Horga also has this nasty little problem of brutally killing outsiders who make even the most minor of infractions. But there doesn't seem to be a single leader of the Horga. There are community elders, maybe, but like charismatic leaders, not especially. It is stated that members of the group do leave the community as young adults and then return, but it doesn't seem like they're getting a gun put to their head and being forced to come back home. And I don't think that really qualifies as a cult. I don't think the Horga are really a cult at all. And interestingly, writer-director Ari Aster didn't see the Horga as a cult either. In an interview with Vox magazine by Alyssa Wilkinson from 2019, Aster says the following. Joe, will you go ahead and take this quote, please?
No, I don't see them as a cult. They might be, but I never called them a cult. For me, they are a community, and they are a family. I wanted them to exist as a place with a history and very clear laws and rules and traditions. I wanted all that to feel very rich and very lived in. At the same time, this is a fairy tale, and they really are exactly what Danny needs. For better or for worse, this is a wish fulfillment fantasy. This is truly a spoiler, but we begin as Danny loses a family, and we end as Danny gains one. And so, for better or worse, they are there to provide exactly what she is lacking and exactly what she needs in true fairy tale fashion.
Aster neatly hits upon a very deep point here that doesn't get discussed enough in regards to this film. The movie is ultimately a fairy tale story, but more in the original Brothers Grimm sense than in the Walt Disney sense. Moreover, I think Danny and the Horga are kind of a perfect match for one another. Danny has been disappointed and heartbroken by her life, and the world around her is not willing to give her support. But the Horga seem to just fold her into the community's life. Sure, you got to deal with the specters of violence that you've just witnessed, but they let you in. They offered to let you work with them to be a part of their celebrations and their traditions. They lifted her up when her very own boyfriend was willing to cast her down. You might argue that the Horga are exploiting her, but you could just as easily say the community has beliefs about taking care of people and offering them safety so long as you take part in their beliefs. Now, I know what you're thinking. Lucas, you little edgelord, you are just siding with the villains because you are a contrarian. And okay, maybe that's a little true. But there is a line from the film that I find absolutely moving. It's brilliantly delivered by the character Pelle, played by Wilhelm Blomgren. And let me read it here. My birth parents both died when I was a little boy. They burnt up in a fire, and I became, technically, an orphan. So believe me when I say, I know what that is, because I do. Yet my difference is, I didn't get a chance to feel lost. Because I had a family, here, where everyone embraced me and swept me up, and I was raised by a community that didn't distinguish between what was theirs and what is not theirs. That's what you were sacrificed to. But I've always felt held by a family, a real family, which everyone deserves, and you deserve. Now, I'm sure that there are plenty of people in our audience who have lost a loved one or endured the destruction of their sole support network. Those of us who have been through that understand what it is like to be absolutely cast adrift in the world. It's hell. And who amongst us wouldn't want a community around them to catch us when we are falling? A community that refused to let us hit the ground when it absolutely fucking mattered. The Horga seem to do this just as a matter of course. It's part of their culture. So with regards to that, I think that element of the story would have fallen flat without the absolutely mesmerizing performance of Florence Pugh as Danny. Every time I watch this movie, I think to myself, she should have gone into therapy after this movie. I get emotionally exhausted just watching her. She very realistically portrays grief and fear in a way that not many others have pulled off in recent memory. I liken her performance to Isabella Adjani in Possession, albeit in a much less unhinged way. Fans of that movie, well, I don't have to explain it to them. She really committed to this role, and she puts herself into a really vulnerable state the entire time. I don't really have any complaints about the cast, and I would absolutely watch Florence Pugh play that role again and again without getting bored. So, take that as an endorsement, I guess.
It's a shocking performance as it is written. It's even more shocking to have somebody buy into the character and really go into that place, because that is a terrifying place. You mentioned earlier that the Horga have had people leave, and they haven't been punished for it. But an outsider, you break the rules, you are punished. It's the opposite of The Village, and I initially compared this movie to The Village and The Wicker Man because it has pieces of those films I've seen. Not talking about the community and the seemingly pagan beliefs or the worship style of the ceremonies they go through, but just where have I seen this before? Where can I reference and compare this to other cult-like activities? And The Village stood out to me because The Village, M. Night Shyamalan film that could have been great, it did what I thought this movie was going to do. The whole premise of The Village is these people living in a field can't go into the woods because the bad things are going to get you. And occasionally, the bad things show up and warn you that they're still there. And it's M. Night Shyamalan, so you know the movie ends with it not being that.
Yeah, of course.
But it could have been that. And for the lives of the characters in that film, it still is. The only people that know the truth are the elders who made the decision and one person who was capable of venturing out without bringing back the wonder of what the outside world is. So when Danny is in those heightened states of anxiety and grief and fear and all that is in between those emotions, man, that's present day for me. I can feel that.
Sure.
And what I'm trying to get to is, you know how it feels when you feel like you're trapped or you feel like you're being chased, but you're not?
Yeah. I know
Man,
what you mean.
that's what she's doing. It's like you're not being held here. In a weird way, she gets what the community is putting out, what their beliefs and their social structure. In a way, she gets it for all the things you just said. They're a community of people who embrace you as a family. It's because they're not trying to keep her there. She feels like she's being trapped. If that makes any sense at all, that's where my mind goes when I watch that character and I watch that performance. She's really going there. She could leave at any time, and for some reason, that grief and that fear keeps her there. It's calling it Stockholm syndrome is factually incorrect, but I don't have a better way to explain it. She becomes conditioned to that environment.
See, man, I don't know. Like, we were talking recently about how grief is a really weird emotion and it doesn't really obey the way you would think other emotions should. Like, it has its own timeline and its own bullshit. I think we've all seen it in our own lives probably at some point where a person, they lose a spouse, they lose a parent, they lose a sibling, they lose a child, whatever. They go through some extreme traumatic loss and they turn to either their community network, be that their family or their friends or their social group or whatever, or they turn to their religious community. Think they turn to their church, their synagogue, whatever. I would say in most cases, those groups are doing their level best to give this person the best support they need. And I think that's a valuable thing. Humans are communal primates. We like being in groups of people because we have, all of this evolution that says we survive better as a group. Thankfully, most people, when they go through that kind of trauma, don't end up fucked over by cults. But every so often, they do. And that's where those horror stories really emerge. And I hate to say it, but those horror stories are probably a little more common than we'd like to believe. Thankfully, they're not as common as we could be afraid of. So with Danny, the character, there's this part of me that wonders is she being abused into the situation? Well, maybe, but I think if she's being abused or hurt into this situation, into joining the Horga, it's not by the Horga. It's by her boyfriend and his social group and the absence of her family. Because, okay, spoiler alert, I think Joe will go in and add after the break, or Joe will go in after post and add in when to skip the spoilers.
The next section of the Fright Lab contains spoilers for the film Midsommar. If you'd like to be surprised when you watch this film, skip forward to 38 minutes and 39 seconds.
But when you're thinking about the death of all of all of the social group she arrives with, they all die for breaking rules within the community, but she's not exactly like heartbroken by the fact that they're all dead, because let's get real, they're kind of assholes. Do they deserve the treatment they get? No, of course not. They're assholes, but they're not that kind of asshole. But at the same time, they put themselves in a very dangerous situation, and they just didn't realize exactly how dangerous that situation was. So I don't think they took advantage of her. I think maybe she didn't understand the full rules of the game. Maybe there was a sin of omission there, but I don't think there's an effort on their behalf to abuse her into compliance, if that makes sense.
Where does that fall on that bite model?
That's that, man. I wish I were an expert to actually talk about that. I really do. And if for some reason Dr. Stephen Hassan is listening to this show, you should email us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. Yes, stuck the landing on that one again, too.
I bring it up because that seems to be something that happens in the horror movies about cults. There's always the rules being held back. I love The Wicker Man.
Sure.
But to quote Christopher Lee, it's not a horror movie. It kind of is, though, because nobody told him what the rules were, and he just magically fulfilled a prophecy that he didn't know about, and now he's dead.
But there's a part of me that also thinks like, this isn't a show about the Wicker Man, but using the Wicker Man plot as the example, at any point, Sergeant Howie could have gotten back on his plane and left. He spent a hell of a lot of time pissing off everybody in that village, and had he just shown up and taken the word, no, Rowan isn't here, well, fuck it, I guess I've got to go. Maybe he walks out alive, but he does spend the entire movie literally insulting every person he comes across and just kind of being aggressive to everyone he meets. Okay, are the inhabitants of Summer Isle the best people in the United Kingdom? Probably not.
No.
They're a little mean. The whole human sacrifice thing, a little rough. Maybe shouldn't be doing that so much.
Could you imagine if somebody had a telescope or a good pair of binoculars? Like, what do you see from the coast of the next island over, right? What are they doing over there? It looks like they're building that's a giant wooden man. What's that for?
Oh, those crazy weirdos on Summer Isle. But their apples are really good. So
really good.
I'm just going to look the other way and pretend I don't see the giant sacrificial altar they're building.
I don't want to take away from the director, because Midsommar, it does that. The outsiders are punished very quickly. And when you talk about it was the boyfriend and his social structure that was really tearing her down and forcing her into the situation, yeah, that hits home too, because sometimes people's friends are shit. And and if you are a person who says, not my friends, they are, it's okay. People that care about you, and they will speak and tell you what you need to hear. But sometimes people need to not speak because it's not their business. And if his friends had just shut their mouths and let him deal with his relationship situation, then this movie doesn't happen. It felt Eli Roth-ish to me. You know, Hostel, Cabin Fever, Green Hell, I think is the name of the
Green
movie.
Inferno.
Green Inferno, thank you so much. It felt a little bit like that, where somebody's designed to survive this because the plot of the movie, so everybody else has to die for reasons. It's also very old school horror, right?
Sure.
There's always, every character in the movie is a trope. Post 1970s, 1980s, they're going to die because of their trope. This doesn't do that, but you know, when people start dying, it's weird for me to say it this way, but I didn't expect Danny to survive the movie. I kept waiting for it to be a dream, but I knew everybody else was going to get some comeuppance. I would have been surprised if anyone else had walked out of this and not been murdered.
You know, I think there's a certain level of xenophobia that all humans end up exhibiting at some points. The fear of the outsider, the fear of the alien. You know, it could have been very easily, I think, in the hands of a lesser writer, that Danny shows up, sees all of this, and becomes the damsel running through the woods, chased by the weirdos in Slavic clothing, carrying axes. Could have very easily gone that way, and it didn't. And I think Aster's a better writer because of it. But
that's Eyes of Fire, my friend.
Oh, sure. I mean, look, I love that. I love that absolute bonkers ass film. So no, I think that's a very interesting point. At the same time, you know, Aster says it in that quote that we found of, you know, this is a fairy tale ultimately, and he's not wrong. I have a theory of sorts that a lot of horror films are like perverted fairy tales in a way. And I might expand on that some other time. That's another episode for another day. But yeah, there is an element of a kind of a dreamy kind of fairy tale thing that, you know, she's folded in and becomes the summer queen, the May queen, and, you know, takes part in this ritual to revitalize the community, blah, 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 blah. You know, thankfully, I can, you know, just looking at some research I did while I was looking at this show, there is such a thing as what they call pagan reconstructionism, which is this idea of people trying to go into scholarly texts and historical research and actually try to rebuild regional religions as close as they can to the real thing. And kudos to Ari Aster for talking about this culture in this way. I mean, obviously the Horga is not real, and it's kind of a hodgepodge of a number of there's no better term for it. Some regional paganisms, the sort of Nordic tradition, you know, on a lot of the costumes, there are these sort of quasi-runic symbols and things like that. And there's some kind of deep lore with those that isn't worth getting into necessarily. But like also, the costumes are more of a Slavic, Eastern European kind of historical thing. It's a wholly convincing world. It is, as Ari Aster said, a lived-in world that feels very real. And I think that's part of the power of the movie, totally, is that it feels real. It's not some wild-eyed Lovecraftian, you know, Cthulhu cult. It's very real kind of, oh, these people have these kind of pagan-y, return to the earth, spirits of the forest kind of beliefs. It doesn't feel that weird because it is just a hair real. So, no, that's an interesting point. I do like that a lot. And I don't know. I do think putting Eyes of Fire and Midsommar on an afternoon watch list, it could be really, really awkward and upsetting. So, you know, I might do that later. That's an interesting idea. So, the Horga. Is it a cult? Maybe in that small group practicing a religion in an isolated place sort of way. They might not be much different than the cults of pagan Roman deities that were around after the empire adopted Christianity. They just kind of stayed in place, and until they were totally subsumed, kept doing things the way they had been doing things, just in this very, very Roman way. And as I stated at the top of the episode, you know, religion is a highly personal thing. For most people who are traditionally religious or even non-traditionally religious, religions provide a manner of stability and understanding in a world that can seem chaotic or cruel or uncaring. Individuals who find themselves pulled into authoritarian groups, cults, whatever you want to call them, they aren't stupid people. Maybe they're lost or grieving or just plain lonely. We live in a world that actively wants to shit on lost, grief-stricken, and lonely people. No one would accuse the characters of Danny or Pele of being stupid, right? They're visibly not. And when a group has taken control of everything you know, has absolutely tried to rob you of your understanding of the world, it's extremely difficult to let go of that. It's not just that you're a member. It's that your membership has utterly rewritten your metaphysical world. They have changed what words mean, and they have violently altered your sense of self. Cults inflict on us what a community is supposed to help us find. And let's get real here for just a split second. Anyone is capable of being sucked into this sort of thing. Like I said at the top of the episode, no one is immune to propaganda. I think a lot about Philip K. Dick when discussing cults or cultic milieu. Two things that he has written really stick out to me. First, quote, "The basic tool for the manipulation of reality is the manipulation of words. If you can control the meaning of words, you can control the people who must use the words," end quote. And secondly, quote, "For every person, a sentence, a series of words exists that can destroy them. There also exists a series of words that can heal them. You may not get the second, but you can be sure of getting the first," end quote. So long as humans exist, there will always be someone screwing around with the heads and hearts of others. Sometimes it's the one-on-one manipulation of a narcissist or a psychopath, but sometimes it's a whole group of people. Humans are communal creatures, like we've said. We like having people around us who are like ourselves or working towards the same goals as we are. The horror world is like that in many ways. Diana Prince, aka Darcy the Mail Girl, seems to have been the first one to have coined the term the mutant family based on Joe Bob Briggs' Drive-In Mutant Manifesto speech. Family is a powerful thing. And if you aren't getting along with the blood relatives, there are many people in the world who are happy to make you into their own family. I'm glad that I am not the sort of narcissist who wants his listeners to regard him as their great leader. I can't speak for Joe in that regard.
We now begin the 2 minutes of hate.
Brilliantly done, sir. Well done.
I don't know how we had this episode without mentioning 1984, but anytime cults and the controlling of words comes up in conversation, I always think of 1984. And I want to ask you this question.
Sure.
For the record, this time, since the microphones are in fact rolling.
Yeah.
Big Brother, is it the media or is it the government?
¿Por qué no los dos? Why not both? You know, state cults exist in a way. Like, I think the one most people will point to is North Korea, and that's not inherently incorrect. It's a very complicated subject, and, you know, this is not a political podcast, so I'm not going to get into, you know, North Korea as a political entity. When you're dealing with a totalitarian milieu, a cultic milieu, you have to understand that a thing can be one thing, another, both, or neither, right? I could say Big Brother is the media, Big Brother is the state, Big Brother is state-controlled media, Big Brother is media-controlled state. It's both, or neither of those inherently exist. They're both lies and illusions. The cultic milieu has almost nothing to do with consensus truth, has nothing to do with consensus reality, our shared objective universe. It is the subjective universe of an individual inflicted onto the objective universes of others. That's going to be my statement on it. You can patent that. I don't know where I'm going to do with that, but you know what I mean.
Is there a single better example of controlling the words? What was the big sentence in 1984? It was doublethink, I think.
Oh, I mean the entire newspeak concept of, you know, and this is a kind of saucy subject for me, because on one hand, the way you manipulate language does end up manipulating things, as Philip K. Dick pointed out. But there's also an element of, you know, the idea of doublethink, that you have to hold two ideas in your head simultaneously and you can't let them contradict, even if they very clearly contradict each other. You know, we've been at war with, we've been at war with Eurasia. We've always been at war with Eurasia, but no, we've actually been at war with East Asia. We've always been at a war with East Asia, whatever the what was. I haven't
Which one is it?
Yes, no, both, neither. I mean, that's the point, right? Like, listen, I don't know if you've ever spent any time reading or listening to Charles Manson's quote unquote philosophy. It is 99% nonsense. There is very little of it that is of any philosophical value. But there are people who fucking bought into it hook, line, and sinker and were willing to murder people brutally on his behalf, you know? So yeah, and I'm not going to take away individual responsibility for the Manson family murders. They are still responsible for what they did. But would they have done it without a total, I don't know, a total destruction of their metaphysics, a total destruction of their epistemological understanding of the word? I don't know. I mean, again, I'm not an expert. So, with that, my dear audience, I want to know what you guys think about Midsommar. Are the Horga a cult, in your opinion? And what's your favorite cinematic cult group? You know, we've got some good things here. I am a big fan of The Wicker Man, as we all know. So, to talk about that, email us at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. We are also on Letterboxd as, one word, FrightLabPod. We can be followed on Instagram at fright_lab_pod. And I know we've been slacking off in both of those arenas, but we'll get that back on track. You know we do. Also, we have a Discord server. Joe, can you tell our fans where they can take part in that discussion and where else fans might find your work?
The Fright Lab podcast on Discord can be found at the bottom of this episode. There are links in the show notes, discord.frightlabpod.com. I'd also like to announce you may see our links changing because, Lucas, we have thefrightlab.com.
Nice and easy transition there.
Happy birthday, Merry Christmas, and whatever else you want to throw at that, my friend. If you are a fan of all things heavy metal, you need to listen to the podcasts we are creating at discussmetal.com. We talk about your favorite bands, my favorite bands, heavy metal subjects, and everything in between. John and AJ over at the Nerf Herder Council, they have everything Star Wars, sci-fi, and nerdy under their belts. I've been hanging out with AJ, talking about some Star Trek, and always hanging out, having a good time. But the Fright Lab, you're listening to it. Thank you. You can find us at thefrightlab.com. You heard Lucas say it. Send us an email at thefrightlabpodcast@gmail.com. We want to know what you have to say, and you can say it many different ways. All those links are in our show notes. What I need from you right now is take out your phone, scroll to the left, scroll to the right, find the place where you can leave the 5-star review, leave the thumbs up, leave the comments. Tell us what you have to say about Midsommar and any of the other episodes in this growing library of awesome. FrightLabPodcast.com, TheFrightLab.com. That's where we are. That's where we will be. Lucas, tell everyone how much we love independent artists and independent media.
The Fright Lab is a DIY project. It is a labor of love. It is something that Joe and I do because, goddammit, we love a good scary movie and we love the people around good scary movies. But you know what? Indie media can sometimes feel a little thankless because you're just kind of screaming into the void. Unless you have a community, not like the Horga, but rather like the community we want to build surrounding horror media. If you want to get there safe, go with a team. And we're trying to form that team as we speak. And, as always, The Fright Lab is written and researched by me, Lucas Yoakum. Joseph Wren is my faithful co-host and producer. We appreciate each and every one of you, and we will talk to you all again very, very soon.